Chapter 9, 31st of October, 1915. We could not leave Samson behind us quickly enough, although now, with the sunlight on it, it had lost its haunted look. It was only now that I was on the way back home that it occurred to me how worried Mother must have been all this time, how I longed to see her again. I thought no more of ghosts or curses, but only of the joys of being home with her again, of how I would drink and then climb into bed and pull the blankets up over my ears and go to sleep for as long as I wanted. We both knew, though, the kind of welcome that was awaiting us. We knew the anger and the inquisition that we would have to face, so our relief that we were at last off Samson was tempered with a certain reluctance to arrive. I remember there was precious little wind that day, only the gentlest of breezes, so we did not bother even to set the sail. The warmth of the sun was lifting the last remnants of the fog off the sea as we rowed slowly down the channel past Puffin Island towards Briar and home. "Father's going to strap me, he always does," said Daniel. "I suppose I can't expect him not to, not after I took his boat, but it'll only make it worse if I tell him we were on Samson. He'd burst his boiler if he thought we'd been anywhere near the place. You know what it's like about rules." "What are we going to tell them then?" I asked. "The truth," said Daniel. "Only we just leave out the bit about Samson. Went fishing and got lost in the fog. That's all there is to it. Well, we did, didn't we? Didn't know where we were, so we just sat it out until the fog lifted, and here we are. Keep it as true as you like, Gracie, but for goodness sake, don't ever let on we were on Samson." "Then we don't have to tell the Birdman either, do we?" I asked. "I don't want to tell him. He'll be angry, I know he will be, and I don't like the look of him when he's angry. And he warned us not to go there, didn't he?" Daniel thought for a moment. "He's about the only person in the world I would never lie to. He's the only one I trust, Gracie. Except of you, of course. I'm going to tell him, Gracie. I'm going to tell him just the way it happened. He won't mind, honest. I know he won't." "Well, you can tell him by yourself," I said. "I'm not going to see him, not until I know he isn't angry with us, and ask him about that thing we found in the cottage. That unicorn's horn or whatever it is." "All right," said Daniel. "I'll go in, I'll ask him. Let's pull a bit slower, Gracie. I'm in no hurry to get home." They spotted us as we came over the sandbars past Puffin Island. Everyone came running down onto the beach. You could see the news spreading through the island. People were running from cottage to cottage, and then they were hurrying down towards us, so that by the time I threw out our anchor, almost everyone on the island must have been there to meet us. I could see Mother in amongst them, looking pale and tired under her dark shawl. I waved to her, but she did not wave back. Daniel's family were there too, Big Tim in amongst them, and it was Big Tim who came wading out into the shallows to help us haul the boat up onto the sand. "You're for it now," he said, and the smile on his face was more one of menace than of welcome. "You're really for it." There were tears of relief at first. Mother held me to her briefly, and she took me by the arm and led me away through the crowd. She did not say a word to me. I saw Auntie Mildred covering him with kisses in spite of Daniel's effort to escape her clutches, but any tears of joy soon gave way to rage, and Daniel was subjected to a barrage of furious questioning. He was immediately surrounded by his brothers and sisters, and his mother led me up off the beach. I heard behind me his father's thunderous voice. "You wait till I get you home. You just wait. How dare you? How dare you take out one of my boats without asking me first? I'll teach you a lesson you'll never forget." And when his mother intervened on Daniel's behalf, he roared again. "It's as much your fault as his. Letting him run wild, and now look what he's done. Every boat on the island's been out looking for him, and he comes back here bold as brass after all the trouble he's caused. I'll tan him black and blue, you see if I won't." Mother waited until we were far enough away from the crowd before she said a word. "I had shamed her in front of everyone," she said. How was she ever to hold her head up again on the island after this, with everyone thinking she had sent me out fishing for her at my age? But gradually her grip on my arm relaxed, and we walked on side by side in silence for some time. "I thought I had lost you, Gracie," she said. "I didn't think I was ever going to see you again. I spent all last night wondering how I was going to tell your father when he got home." She stopped, put her hand on my shoulder, and then lifted my face to look into hers. "I know why you went out in that boat, Gracie Jenkins. I can do without the money," she said, "but I can't do without you. If needs be, I can sell the boat. We'd have enough then to pay the rent for a year or two, and we'd be able to buy all the food we need for the winter. Your father can always build another one when he gets back. You won't ever go off like that again, will you, Gracie? Promise me you won't. Never again." "I promise," I said, and she kissed me on my forehead. "You're cold," she said. "You're ice cold." "I'm more thirsty than cold, Mother," I said. So I had my water at last, 3 mugs of it, brimful and wonderful. She put me to bed after that with a hot stone bottle at my feet, and she sat down on the bed beside me. I waited for her questions to come, but she said nothing more about it, only that for the first time since Father left, she was glad he was not home. "He'd have hit the roof," she said. "But then I suppose you'd never have gone out fishing in the first place, if he had been here, would you? There'd be no need for it, would there? And if he knew why you'd gone out, Gracie, he'd have been proud of you, that's for sure, like I am." "He'll be back soon," I said. "Won't be long, Mother. The war can't last forever, can it?" "Can't it?" she sighed as she got up to go, gathering her shawl around her. "Gracie," she said, "best not to go and play with Daniel for a bit. You're not the most popular girl on Briar just at the moment, you know. There's plenty of people, Daniel's mother amongst them, think you've been getting Daniel into mischief. Personally, I think it's 6 to 1, half a dozen of the other. Don't you? I rarely dream, and if I do, I can scarcely ever remember them. But I dreamed a dream that night after my return from Samson that was so vivid, I have never forgotten it. I saw through a sunlit fog fleeting glimpses of Father riding over the sea on a bright white unicorn. He was in his sailor's uniform, and he rode so fast that his hat fell off. He was laughing when he jumped down to retrieve it. Then the unicorn galloped off into the fog and left him alone, standing on the sea. He looked everywhere for his hat, but he could not find it. It did not seem to worry him, though, because he was laughing all the time. As he sank into the sea, he was still laughing and waving at me. All that night, I kept waking up and falling asleep again, only to dream the same dream again and again. I wanted to tell Daniel about my dream. He was the only one I could tell, but there was no opportunity to do so. He had been forbidden to play with me, and so we only saw each other now when we went to school, and then there always seemed to be other children around us. Even in playtime, at school, we were not left alone. Overnight, it seemed like we'd become famous. We were the heroes of the hour, and constantly surrounded now by admirers who wanted to find out everything that had happened to us when we'd gone missing in the fog. However much we told them, they wanted to know more, and so Daniel invented more. Each time he told the story, he filled it out with colourful and often inconsistent embellishments, but no one seemed to notice. They hung on his every word. I noticed, though, that Big Tim and his friends never came to listen to Daniel. They stood in a huddle in the furthest corner of the playground, whispering to each other and glowering over their shoulders at us. I did try to warn Daniel that I thought they were up to something, but he ignored me. Indeed, as the days passed, I felt Daniel was hardly even listening to me anymore. I did not know why, but Daniel seemed quite unlike himself now, since our return from Samson. It was not that he avoided me. On the contrary, he stayed so close to me that all day that I began to feel he was trying to protect me from something. But he had become distant towards me, almost cold. He hardly ever spoke to me, and when he did, it was in monosyllables, and he kept looking around all the time as if he were expecting something to happen. Even on the way back from school, coming down our lane, when we were quite alone at last, he seemed to prefer to walk beside me in stony silence. I could have told him then about my dream, but there were more important, more urgent things I had to know. "You been to see the birdman yet?" I asked, and not for the first time. He shook his head and looked away. "When are you going then?" I went on. "You said you were going to ask him about that horn thing in the cottage. You said you would." "Soon," he said, and he walked on down the lane towards home, his hands deep in his pockets. "Your father strap you?" I asked him. He nodded, but said nothing more. "Does it hurt still?" "Bit," he said. "See you tomorrow." And he ran off up the path towards his house. "Watch out for Big Tim," I called after him. He's hatching something. I know he is, Daniel. He waved his hand over his head and went inside. At the time, I put it down to the beating his father had given him. It had to be that. I could think of no other reason why he should suddenly have become so quiet and so sad. Terrible things happen on quite ordinary days, and there is never any warning. It must have been a week, I suppose, after we came back from Samson. I met Daniel as usual at the gate that morning, and we walked together up the lane to catch the boat to school. We always went the long way because Big Tim and his friends went the short way, and we always liked to keep well away from them. It was a gusty autumn morning, with the leaves chasing each other in crazy circles down the lane. I remember Daniel was behaving even more strangely than usual. He kept glancing behind us. And then, just before we joined the others on the boat, he said quietly, not looking at me at all, "Gracie, if anything happens at school today, just keep out of it. Don't say anything, no matter what happens. Understand?" There was no time to ask any whys or wherefores, no time even to reply. It was a rough, buffeting crossing to Tresco, but I liked it that way. It took longer, and there was always just a chance that if it got worse in mid-channel, we would have to turn round and go back home again, but it did not. Big Tim sat in the bow of the boat with his friends as he always did, but then I saw that he was staring at us and grinning. They all were. There was menace in their eyes. I looked at Daniel and found him glaring back at his brother. There was a look of utter contempt on his face. In assembly, Mr. Well-Beloved thundered in his daily tirade against the brutal German enemy, and we all sang "God Save the King," as lustily as usual. Then, in his arithmetic lessons, we all had to recite our 7 times tables aloud. Of all of them, this was the one I loathed and dreaded the most. I managed to stutter my way through it, but it was not good enough, and he told me to stay in after lunch and write it out 20 times. At break time, I followed Daniel out into the playground. We went and sat together, as we often did, by the coal shed. I tried to ask Daniel again about the Birdman. "You told the Birdman yet about Samson? You asked him what the fire was for?" But he never had time to answer me. They were all around us, about 10 of them in all, and Big Tim stood above us against the sky, his thumbs hitched over his belt. His head was in the sun, but I could see the cruel grin was still on his face. I'd never really looked at Big Tim until then, not closely. I suppose that was because I had grown up with him and was too used to him to notice him. Above his high collar, his face had the look of a sweating red pudding. But as I got to my feet, it was not his face I was looking at, but the massive fist clutching his belt. He grinned at me and pushed me back against the wall. Daniel stepped between us. "Leave her be," he said. "She's nothing to do with it." "You're in it together," Big Tim said. "You're always together. Isn't that right? If you're guilty, she's guilty." And there was an ugly chorus of agreement from his friends behind him. "Guilty of what?" Daniel said. "All right, so you saw me coming out of the Birdman's cottage last night. What's the harm in that?" "But that's not the half of it, is it, Danny boy?" Big Tim went on, an unpleasant sneer in his voice. "A Hun lover, that's what you are. I've got a Hun lover for a little brother. No use denying it, Danny boy." And he put a hand on Daniel's chest and pushed him back against the wall beside me. "We saw you. We've seen you often, haven't we? And not just last night, Danny boy." "Keep a good lookout," Welly Belly said. "For king and country." And so we did. And what did we find out? But my little brother running down along Rushy Bay, up into the Birdman's house on Heathy Hill. A stroke of luck, really, to see you, because we've been watching that house the last few days, keeping an eye on him. Do you know why, Danny boy? Well, of course you do. That friend of yours, that Birdman, he's the only one on Briar who doesn't close his curtains at night like he should. Now, why do you think that is, eh? He pushed Daniel harder against the wall. Well, I'll tell you why. It's because he's a spy. He's a Hun-loving spy, and he's signalling to German submarines out at sea. That's why. And that makes you the friend of a spy, doesn't it, Danny boy? Don't be silly, said Daniel. He wouldn't do that. He doesn't even like the war. Says no one ever wins a war anyway, so there's no point in fighting it. He doesn't want anyone to win it. Doesn't he indeed? So he's a Hun lover, just like I said he was. A Hun lover and a spy. Big Tim's friends closed in around us. He went on. Father's going to find this all very interesting when I tell him. He'll tan you again, Danny boy. That's after I've finished with you. You can tell father what you like, said Daniel, but you can't prove anything. Just leave the Birdman alone. He hasn't done anyone any harm. Leave him alone. Do you hear me? The only reason you can see lights from his cottage is because he hasn't got any curtains, that's all. Big Tim looked a little taken aback at this. No curtains, he said. That's no excuse. Got blankets, hasn't he? Everyone's got blankets. He could put up blankets. He's a spy right enough, and you're in it with him. Both of you are. Can't you understand? Daniel said. He hates the war. Says it turns men into savages. He doesn't even care who wins or loses. Doesn't care, eh? Said Big Tim, taking Daniel by the ear and twisting it viciously. So he doesn't care who wins the war. That's what we thought, isn't it, lads? So here's what we're going to do, Danny boy. When I get home, I'm going to tell father all about you and the Birdman. And he'll tell the Navy, and they'll come and search his place and question him until he tells everything. And if he doesn't come up with the right answers, then you know what happens to spies, don't you? They shoot them and their friends. And he twisted Daniel's ear even harder, forcing him down onto his knees. The silent tears on Daniel's face at last spurred me to action, and I threw myself at Big Tim, lashing out with arms and legs, but it was to little effect. He did have to let go of Daniel, but then he just held me at arm's length and laughed at me as I flailed pathetically, my arms far too short even to reach him. Then someone called out that Mr. Well-Beloved was on the prowl, so he grabbed my arm, twisted my wrist up behind me and pushed me to the ground beside Daniel. That's where you both belong, in the dirt, like all Hun lovers. You won't see him again. He'll confess and tell them everything. I shouldn't like to be in your shoes when you get home this afternoon. And he was gone. Daniel helped me to my feet. I told you to stay out of it, he said, his hand cupping his ear. I told you, didn't I? But they won't shoot him, will they? I said. Of course not, Gracie. They'll find out he didn't do anything. Not on purpose, anyway. They're not stupid like Big Tim. But we're both in trouble now. Big Tim will tell everyone all about us and the Birdman, and they'll try to stop us from ever seeing him again. You can be sure of that. Daniel, I said, brushing myself down, why did you tell me you hadn't been to see the Birdman? He didn't answer me. You told me you hadn't been, and you had. He looked at me and then looked away again quickly. I didn't want to have to tell you, Gracie. He spoke quietly, almost as if he was talking to himself. He was going to tell you himself, Gracie, he said. It's about the curse. The curse of Samson. It's like you said. It's like your father told you. It's all true. But there's more. And just then, Mr. Well-Beloved appeared around the corner. Anything the matter? He asked. No, sir, said Daniel. Then run along in. Break's over. Bell's going. After lunch, I had to stay in to write out my 7 times table 20 times. And Mr. Well-Beloved kept me at it all afternoon, sending me back and back to do it again until I got it right. But I never did get it right. I kept making small mistakes, for my mind was not on my work that day. I was not thinking of Big Tim and having my arm twisted again. I was thinking only about the curse of Samson. Would it be me or Daniel to suffer the curse first? I wondered if the house would be burnt down when I got home. I wondered if Mother would be sick with the fever or whether we would drown on the way back to Briar. We'd have to tell Mother, to warn her. We'd have to tell her before someone else did. All about the Birdman and Samson, and I knew how hurt she'd be, that I had deceived her all this time, how I dreaded going home that afternoon. The boat from Tresco dropped us at the quay as usual, and we took a different way home, up through the town, for fear of meeting Big Tim and his friends. As we passed the houses, we noticed that people were gathered whispering in their doorways, and they would disappear indoors as we approached. We saw them peering out at us through their windows. Even the vicar looked away and did not speak to us as he hurried by in his billowing black cassock, and that was most unusual for him. When we reached my front gate, Daniel's mother was waiting there, and she took him roughly by the arm and whisked him away into the house. What's the matter? He asked. What have I done now? But she said nothing, and I noticed she seemed not to want to look at me. Mother was sitting in her usual chair, but it was not usual for her to be sitting down at this time of the day. Come here, Gracie, dear, she said in her voice. She said her voice an unnatural whisper. When she lifted her head and looked at me, I could see she had been crying. "We've lost your father," she said. "Lost him?" I said. "He's missing, Gracie," she said, and she held up a letter and handed it to me. It was a brick red envelope that I held in my hand, and the address on the outside was in pencil, as was the writing on the letter I took out. It read, "The Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty regret to inform you that J591671, able seaman Peter Jenkins of HMS Louis, was reported missing in action on the 31st of October 1915. "That means he's not coming back, doesn't it?" I said. "Oh, why him?" Mother said. "Why us?" I knew well enough the answer to that question.